The case of Oscar Slater remains one of the great miscarriages of justice in Scottish legal history.
The dice were loaded against Slater really from the start.
They were saying, there's Oscar Slater. Look, there's Oscar Slater, he's just out of prison. And my cousin leaned over and said, look, see that man there? Well, you couldn't mistake him.
There was no court of criminal appeal in Scotland. What this meant was that an individual could be convicted of murder and sentenced to death without having any opportunity to challenge the verdict or the punishment.
The outrageous nature of his conviction for the murder of Marion Gilchrist resulted in the attention being drawn to the case by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, and he used the techniques which he applied in the novels of Sherlock Holmes.
Marion Gilchrist was found with her head towards the fender of the fire and her feet pointing towards the door of the room. But this is what the house looked like at the time she was killed.
Scotland tends to pride itself in having a fair system and relatively few miscarriages. Cases down south are often quoted, the Birmingham 6, the Guildford 4. Right up with them, I think the case of Oscar Slater as the Glasgow 1 merits a mention.
Glasgow throws up more than enough grisly murder stories to satisfy the keenest consumer of true crime, but there are few more fascinating than this one. A mysterious case dating back to the early 1900s, it remains unsolved to this day, despite the fact that a man served 18 years hard labour, accused of bludgeoning the defenceless victim to death. St Fillan's Avenue in Ayrshire. It was here in 1928 that a German Jewish immigrant came seeking a fresh start, having spent nearly 2 decades in prison. Oscar Slater lived out the rest of his days here in unremarkable fashion, but his life up to that point reads like the stuff of Agatha Christie.
Issues of miscarriage of justice have not gone away. However, there has probably not been a case quite as blatant as Slater's.
I think because of the miscarriage of justice, people did talk about it, and it still remained a mystery. Did he do it, or did someone else do it?
Glasgow locals can still enjoy a drink in a pub adorned by photographs of Oscar Slater.
We're also a stone's throw from India Street, where Slater frequented the motor and the slopper clubs. So we're right in the heart of where both Slater and Gilchrist coexisted, let's say, and for Marion Gilchrist, where she lived the last days of her life.
It all started when a shady Eastern European chose the city as his home. Always surviving, but never becoming rich, he had wandered far. Oscar Joseph Leschenzer was born in 1872 in Oppeln, then a part of East Germany. His parents scraped by as bakers, but Oscar showed little interest in the family business. He had a good head for numbers and found a job as a bank clerk in Hamburg, but it wasn't to last long.
National Service was calling Oscar, and Oscar, no doubt, was drawn perhaps by an alternative life and certainly seemed to want to avoid national service. So he left Germany and spent time in mainland Europe, America, and of course in Britain.
And there he embarked on a life of low-level crime, involved in illegal gambling. He stood trial for assault and malicious wounding and was released, freed of those charges. And then gradually he decided to detach himself from London, moved initially to Edinburgh, and then in 1908 we find him resident in Glasgow.
Slater had been briefly married, but left his alcoholic wife. He was now in a relationship with a 20-year-old Parisian woman.
Her name was André Juniot Antoine. She worked during the day while he was out gambling, and she welcomed gentlemen callers to their house in 69 St George's Road, which was a flat in a multiple occupancy building, which is nowadays known as Charing Cross Mansions, and still there to this day.
It's been suggested by some who have researched the case of Oscar Slater that he was actually already known to the authorities in Glasgow as being a man who was disreputable and involved in unsavoury business.
The immigrant used various assumed names as he lived from hand to mouth, pimping, gambling, and receiving stolen goods, often jewellery. He was fast building a reputation with the city's police as a bad lot, in a society that was at the time greatly anti-Semitic.
Slater came to Glasgow at a time when there were tremendous prejudices afoot. Not only was he German, he was of Jewish background, and he suffered because of this. There were occasions when he got into trouble, partly because of his gambling proclivities, but also on the basis of his ethnicity and his nationality background. He did get into a brawl at one time. He was involved with the police. He was fined, but he did not do any time in custody.
Victorian Glasgow was a city of many parts.
A bustling city, the second city of the empire. And whilst many merchants and business people were well-to-do and lived a high life, there was also extensive squalor and slums in the city.
People were moving, I think, from the East End, gradually, coming through Blasford Square and moving up, always westward, and new property being built, where next door almost, or the next street, you'd have extreme poverty and then reasonably sort of lower middle class, upper middle class, very rich people, the shipbuilders, tobacco barons, they built or had built for them beautiful big mansions.
There was significant employment, but there was also great poverty as well. Slater found himself on the cusp between the two, but he had great ambitions for self-aggrandizement and for developing his own financial wealth.
Slater tended to rise at midday. He would wander to a music hall or drinking club and only earn a living after nightfall. One business card read, "Dealer of precious stones." He lived literally on the edge of the two contrasting areas of the city. The residents of the grand townhouses here on West Princes Street included Marion Gilchrist, an elderly spinster and sole heiress to her father's colossal estate.
In the summertime, when I was out playing with friends, we would do all the, children's games that we played, and we would say, let's go and see if we can find the close where Miss Gilchrist was murdered.
West Princes Street was formerly known as Queen's Terrace. Advocate Claire Connolly has long studied the case of Oscar Slater. The scene of the crime is much changed today in an area popular with students and young professionals. In 1908, Marion Gilchrist lived at number 15.
Hello, Jonathan. Hi, I'm Claire Connolly.
Nice to meet you.
Pleased to meet you. Thank you very much.
This is it here. I guess this was the original front door. I mean, it was kind of like a big old wooden one back then.
When Marion Gilchrist lived here, this was an old ornate dark wood door, and there were glass panels at the side of the door. And of course, you would have had a lever somewhere around here that the maid of the house, Helen Lambie, could have used to release the front door. And that would then allow, of course, anybody to have a look to see who was coming up the stairs. So it's quite a difference, isn't it?
Yeah, I guess it's a lot more simple now. Anyway, I'll show you in so you can see what this is.
Great, thanks very much.
Marion Gilchrist was in excellent health at the age of 83. She occupied the entire first floor of 15 Queen's Terrace with her 21-year-old maid. Over 20 years, the wealthy spinster had amassed a large collection of precious jewels. She kept them all at home. The front door was the only entrance to the property.
We'd go inside and the doors were open. You could just go in. We'd go in and tiptoe up the stairs to the first landing, and then goodness knows whether we thought the ghost of Miss Gilchrist would come out, but would suddenly become terrified and would run down the stairs screeching.
Oscar Slater and Marion Gilchrist lived less than 1 mile apart. On the face of it, they could not have been more different.
Marion had inherited enormous amounts of wealth from her father. The figure was put at up to £80,000. If that figure was catapulted forward to today, its value would be in the region of £6.5 million. She was no ordinary spinster, she was a very wealthy woman. She also wore her fortune.
Miss Gilchrist was reclusive and did not entertain frequent visitors. When her pet dog died, she was convinced it had been deliberately poisoned.
Her maid Helen Lambie is also reported as having visited a prior employer in the weeks before Marion Gilchrist's death and reporting that her mistress believed she was going to be killed. Now, Marion Gilchrist wasn't a woman, as the foregoing tells us, who would easily open her door to a stranger.
She was incredibly security conscious. She was aware of the fact that there were those who might wish to rob her. She had installed double locks on her doors. She secreted her jewellery around her premises. She had some in her wardrobe and was even reputed to have stitched some of it into her curtains.
There is nothing to suggest that Oscar Slater and Marion Gilchrist ever met. The spinster was a creature of habit. Each evening at 7, her maid, Helen Lambie, went out to buy the newspaper. She did so as usual on December the 21st, 1908, leaving her mistress alone reading.
A few minutes after 7, the Adams family, who lived in the main door flat underneath Marion Gilchrist, heard a thud and 3 knocks on the floor.
The top floor of number 15 was unoccupied. Below Miss Gilchrist's flat, entered through the door of number 14, was a property owned by an unmarried 44-year-old piano dealer. The neighbours kept up a rather formal relationship.
Mr. Adams, who was the neighbour who lived there with his 2 sisters, had an agreement with Miss Gilchrist that if she was in any trouble at all, she would knock the floor and he would come to see if there was anything he could do to help. On this occasion, he went to the apartment, checked it out, couldn't get access, returned home, and then his sisters urged him to go again.
On his return to the door, he was shortly met by Helen Lambie. She then used her keys to open the front door, and according to Adams, she entered the hallway.
A man brushed past the pair after Helen Lambie unlocked the door to the flat, meaning that Miss Gilchrist had let him in.
He seemed unperturbed to Adams and Lambie, smiled, and walked out the front door.
This was a fairly remarkable occurrence, as you would imagine, but Helen didn't seem to be too fazed by this and merely continued to come in and enter the house and go about her business as normal.
The encounter between the maid, the neighbour and the man they said they did not know took just seconds, but that fleeting moment remains a matter of sinister controversy to this day. Helen Lambie and Arthur Adams then went into Gilchrist's flat. Both agreed that the stranger had emerged from one of the bedrooms before he walked out the front door.
Helen Lambie initially went into the kitchen. She then went into the bedroom that the man had appeared from, but didn't say anything to Adams, who asked her where her mistress was.
They both then went into the dining room where Miss Gilchrist had been left reading. The elderly woman had been brutally attacked.
There were extensive head injuries. Her face was badly disfigured, and indeed one of her eyes was missing from the socket.
This was a murder of incredible savagery carried out in such a brutal way in such a defenceless old woman who was unable to look after herself in any way. This was a murder with feeling. There was no immediate signs of a murder weapon, although a chair nearby was covered in blood and also brain matter. In a spare room, a search discovered that a box had been forced open and there were very many valuables lying around, although they had not been taken in the incident.
Marion Gilchrist was still breathing. Shortly after the police arrived, however, she died.
So this is the plan, Jonathan, of Marion Gilchrist's house. The hallway is very significant. That's where Arthur Adams and Helen Lambie saw the man who had entered Marion Gilchrist's house and whom it's presumed had killed her. Arthur Adams had remained at the doorway, and Helen Lambie had initially made her way across the hall into the kitchen, which I believe is at the back of the house.
Yeah, it's actually still our kitchen now.
She then went into the bedroom, the second, it wasn't Marion Gilchrist's bedroom, it was the other bedroom that Marion Gilchrist kept her papers in, that the man had emerged from. Helen Lambie went into that room and found it really in a bit of a mess. Papers had been turned out. But still she hadn't made any mention of her mistress, and Arthur Adams was growing increasingly concerned. So when he had to prompt her to say, well, you know, where is your mistress? And only then did she enter the dining room. And that's where Helen Lambie and Arthur Adams found Marion Gilchrist in the final moments of her life. And I believe that dining room is now your room.
It's my bedroom now, so yeah.
Perhaps we could go and have a look at that, please.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
Helen Lambie and Arthur Adams disagreed on one curious detail. He insisted she had already been halfway across the internal hall when the man appeared from the spare bedroom. Lambie insisted she had remained standing at the front door throughout. Various documents were found, scattered from a wooden box. Marion Gilchrist's considerable collection of jewels would be worth around £230,000 by today's value. Oscar Slater had known to deal in and pawn precious stones, yet only one item had been stolen from the flat.
One crescent-shaped brooch. This was despite the fact that a large number of items of jewellery were out in the open in this room. They were on the table in a little dish. So only one thing had been taken from that dish.
Had he been in that house on that night when Marion Gilchrist was murdered, could he have resisted the temptation to fill every pocket in his coat with the precious gems which he was confronted with when he broke into that house?
It was clear that the wooden boxes containing Gilchrist's private papers had been forced open.
And it suggested at that initial stage that the person who had entered Miss Gilchrist's flat and indeed had ended her life had not been seeking to steal jewels from her, but instead a piece of paper unknown to Helen Lambie that had been contained in that wooden box.
If Oscar Slater, the known jewel dealer, had murdered the old woman, then he certainly hadn't made the most of the spoils she left on display for him. Marion Gilchrist had a niece, a Miss Burrell, who lived just a few minutes' walk away. After being comforted by the neighbours, Helen Lambie, the maid, set off to tell her of what had happened. When she returned, the police noted that she was a little excited, but not much considering the position. And it seemed there was more to Marion Gilchrist than met the eye too.
She did have a very close relationship with a woman by the name of Maggie Ferguson, who had been her former servant. Now, some researchers suggested that Maggie was in fact Marion Gilchrist's illegitimate daughter. And whilst that hasn't been proven, it is certainly the case that they were very close, because Maggie not only called her own daughter Marion Gilchrist, but was the main beneficiary of Marion Gilchrist's substantial estate on her death.
Externally, Marion was the most respectable of spinsters that you could find in the West End of Glasgow. However, she did have a slightly darker side. She did deal with some jewellers in Glasgow, but it was known that she tended to go for some cut-price, tax-free items, which may or may not have been reset from thefts by housebreaking or from jeweller shops.
Two of Gilchrist's nephews were prominent members of Glasgow society. Archibald Charteris was a lawyer, while his brother Francis was a doctor. Only Marion Gilchrist had benefited in her father's will, and her own will had recently been amended.
Shortly before she died, she had changed her will. She had grown fed up with her family, it seemed, and she had changed her will in favour of the Ferguson family. These were the benefactors that she hoped to look after. With this amount of money at stake, perhaps you need look no further than the extended members of her family who were about to lose out on more than £6 million.
The missing brooch was described in a notice dispatched to local police stations. A description of the man seen leaving the flat was also made public.
It was a fairly bland description which could probably have matched half the population of Glasgow. It was a man aged 25 to 35, 5 feet 8 or 9, clean-shaven, wearing a grey overcoat and a hat.
Further evidence emerged on the 23rd of December from a 14-year-old girl, Mary Barrowman.
Mary was an assistant to a local business. She was an errand girl, and she claimed that on the evening of the 21st of December, she collided with a gentleman in the vicinity of Miss Gilchrist's flat.
She gave a separate description and spoke of a man with a bent nose who she had witnessed leaving the property.
It would take many years for Mary Barrowman to admit to a newspaper that she had been put under severe pressure by police. There were discrepancies between the descriptions given by Adams, Lambie and Barrowman, but there were similarities in terms of the man's height, certain items of clothing, and the fact that he was described as having a prominent nose.
Over time, these descriptions were merged into one. And those descriptions and the evidence given by Lambie, by Barrowman and by Adams proved to be absolutely crucial, and indeed the only evidence that in any way suggested that Slater was linked with the death of Marion Gilchrist.
On Christmas evening, a bicycle dealer came forward to police. He told them that Oscar Slater had been trying to sell a pawn ticket.
Slater had offered to him for sale a pawn ticket which related to a diamond brooch that Slater had pawned. The police acted immediately upon this information, visited Slater's home on George's Road.
Slater's lover, Madame Juno, and her maid, Catherine Schmaltz, spoke up for him.
That became hugely significant because it was these two women who could give Slater his alibi, that at 7 o'clock that evening he was not at 15 Queen's Terrace, but instead he was with them on George's Road having dinner.
The alibis given by Slater's lover, Madame Juno, and their maid, Catherine Schmaltz, were completely ignored by Glasgow police. Detectives were told by Schmaltz that Slater was no longer in Glasgow.
He had left there with his girlfriend and he had headed on board the Lusitania to New York. From the point of view of the police, this seemed to provide motive. He had been involved possibly in the robbery, had tried to pawn the brooch and was now on the run.
But it was later proved that the trip had been booked months before.
He was travelling under an assumed name of Mr. and Mrs. Otto Sands with his girlfriend. This added to the suspicions that the police had of him, although his defence was that he had used this name because he was trying to cover his tracks, having left behind his estranged wife May, who had dumped some time previously because of her drink problem. And by the time the Lusitania arrived, the police were waiting for him and he was immediately arrested with a view to starting the extradition proceedings which would have been required to take him back home.
Slater was held in Tombs prison, pending a hearing. He had 3 American counsel who tried to prove his trip was no flight from justice, but the authorities in Scotland were determined. Astonishingly, Helen Lambie the maid, Arthur Adams the neighbour and Mary Barrowman, this so-called eyewitness, were all taken to New York to attend the hearing.
During this voyage, Helen Lambie and Mary Barrowman shared a cabin, but insisted subsequently that at no point had they discussed the case, which many commentators have found extremely odd, that two relatively young women would be on such a voyage over so many days and not discuss the reason why they were going so far from home.
What did they all talk about on that long crossing over the Atlantic?
Ultimately, it was a needless effort because Slater had decided that he wouldn't challenge extradition, and he agreed voluntarily to return to Scotland because he was convinced of his innocence, planned to prove it, and was going to have his day in court so to do.
But by now, at the time Slater was returning to Glasgow, they knew the man to be accused of her murder was a German Jew. At this time, antisemitism was rife in Scotland, and as many predicted that Britain would soon be at war with Germany, both Germany and its nationals were far from popular. All of this combined to make Slater's return of great public interest, and on his arrival at the dock in Glasgow, a large crowd had turned out to see him. The press, excited by the opportunity, took many photographs of him leaving the vessel, handcuffed to a police officer, and these appeared in many publications across the city.
In the meantime, it had also been discovered that the pawn ticket had been issued on the 18th of November, a month before the murder.
It transpired that the brooch which Slater had pawned was not the brooch which Marion had owned and which had disappeared from her house. It was in fact a brooch which had been owned by his girlfriend and which he had pawned on several occasions before.
Once back in Scotland, Slater's luggage was searched.
They discovered a hammer which was considered to be the possibility of a murder weapon, although there were suggestions that in fact the hammer was too small to have caused the wounds which had been inflicted upon the dead woman.
An identification parade was mounted at the end of February 1909. None of those who attended resembled Slater in the slightest.
The witnesses now began to change their stories. Of course, had a fine moustache.
12 witnesses picked out Oscar Slater as having been in the Queen's Terrace vicinity around the time of the killing. There were varying degrees of certainty, but all 12 had seen the press photograph of Slater handcuffed being taken back to Glasgow. It transpired that Helen Lambie had reported to a certain police officer that she had in fact recognised the intruder. A devoted family man, John Thompson Trench, had little in common with Slater, but he would go on to take his side, saying that he was privy to Helen Lambie and Miss Gilchrist's niece, Miss Burrell, together acknowledging the name of the murderer. It didn't help Slater.
When he appeared before the sheriff on petition, he declared his innocence. However, that was not enough. The trial had to go ahead, and it did so in May 1909.
The decision was eventually taken to transfer the case to Edinburgh, where the Crown felt perhaps there was more possibility of a conviction, because in Glasgow, although feelings were running high, there were suggestions that a conviction may not have been possible. In those days, photographers were still allowed in court, and pictures were taken in court of Slater in the dock at the time.
The Crown could provide not one shred of physical evidence against him, such as fingerprints, nor could they argue why a German with poor English would pursue a piece of paper from the home of a woman he had never heard of. Oscar Slater did not give evidence in court. He was represented by lawyer Ewing Spears.
There were some theories at the time that this may have been down to the fact that there was concern that his German accent may have worked against him and may have prejudiced the jury. But whatever reason, he didn't give evidence which could possibly have helped him in the case, and the rest became history.
But several acquaintances did. Hugh Cameron had known Slater for a decade. Under questioning, though, he made a devastating remark.
That he had it that Slater was a man, like many in Glasgow, who lived on the proceeds of women. This was clearly very damning evidence in terms of not only Slater's character, but also implicated both his partner, Madame Juno, and the maid Smalls.
Only the two women could provide anything resembling an alibi, and their testimony fell on deaf ears. Initial inquiries had been made at the flat Slater occupied with the woman by Detective Inspector William Gordon. He could determine nothing to counter the claim that Slater had been at home having dinner.
The fact that Oscar had a reasonably poor background in terms of crime and the ladies worked as prostitutes did not add to their credibility, and as a result the alibi claim was treated somewhat dismissively by the court.
A police conspiracy? A family member shielded? Or both? The lack of attempt to present any forensic evidence in court defies belief.
The only evidence presented at trial that in any way connected Oscar Slater to Marion Gilchrist's murder was the identification evidence given by witnesses. By now, Helen Lambie and Mary Barrowman were telling a very consistent story, as they had done in New York in terms of the description of the man that they had seen. They became almost emphatic and actually quite cheeky when they were in court. And it's reported that their behaviour was really highly inappropriate.
Forensic expert Professor John Glaister said he believed Gilchrist was killed with a claw-headed hammer, but he could not prove positively that it was the one found in Slater's bag. One of his colleagues said that a much heavier item had been used, and one critical witness was not called at all.
Dr. Adams, who had attended at Marion Gilchrist's house on 21st December, and on examining her, had concluded that death had been caused by a blunt force instrument and had identified a dining room chair as the weapon used, was not called to give evidence at the trial.
For the prosecution, Lord Advocate Alexander Ewer gave a 2-hour speech containing gross inaccuracies. He used terms that were anti-Semitic and told the all-male jury that they owed it to their country to return a verdict that was inevitable. The judge then made a breathtaking remark.
During his charge to the jury, he told them that a man of that type, namely Oscar, had no right to rely upon the usual presumption of innocence, and he added that Slater had been living for years in a way that many blackguards would condemn.
No other presiding judge in a British court has uttered such a sentiment before or since.
Yeah, so this is my bedroom as it is today.
Wow.
I guess this is also the room where I first kind of heard about the case, because you know, like when you come to view a flat, you're kind of looking at all the different things and checking it's all in like good order. And I was pretty struck because in this room someone had marked out the shape of a body on the floor in
Really?
in white tape. So, you know, when I was viewing the flat, I think about moving in, I had to kind of find out what it was about. And it turns out the person who stayed here before me, he's kind of like an artist and a filmmaker, and he had done lots of research into the case. So obviously when I moved in, I kind of wanted to take up the tape because it was a bit too much to handle every day. When
Absolutely. Marion Gilchrist and caused her death, that being stamped upon. So very grand room, which in what must have been a very grand
property. You can still see
property.
traces of the cornicing's still kind of the same, and just the general shape of the room as well, I guess. It's, you know.
German Jewish immigrant Oscar Slater had stood trial accused of the murder, even though all the evidence pointed elsewhere. The sentence for murder in 1909 was the most severe that could be imposed.
It was not surprising that the jury only took about an hour and 10 minutes to come back with a guilty verdict.
The judge ignored Slater's protestation and instead donned his black cap and sentenced Slater to death.
A man who'd voluntarily come back to protect what little reputation he had. He was convinced he would prove his innocence, and he told the judge, "I came over from America knowing nothing of this. You have convicted an innocent man."
The police, and now the public, knew that Oscar Slater was by no means whiter than white. Still, many had grown uncomfortable with the handling of the case. The sentence was eventually commuted to life imprisonment, which Slater was to serve in HMP Peterhead.
Slater only found out about the reprieve 36 hours before he was due to hang.
Slater faced the rest of his life behind bars. Detective Inspector John Trench did not give up, however, eventually forwarding an allegation of a cover-up to the Scottish Secretary. Mary Barrowman's employer went on to reveal that there was no way the girl could have been on Queen's Terrace at the time she had stated to police. Meanwhile, Slater grew accustomed to long days of hard labour in the northeast prison.
This was a man who had no real moral compunction. He lived on illegal and immoral earnings, but regardless of what you might think of him and the way he lived his life, he certainly seems not to have been a killer. And he lost the best years of his life, incarcerated in Peterhead prison, doing hard labour, being birched, all for a stitch-up.
There was also much support for Slater from influential voices, including the creator of the world's best-loved fictional detective. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was a prolific campaigner against miscarriages of justice.
His prominent position in British society and the fact that he had the ear of politicians and other influential people undoubtedly contributed to the fact that a decision was made that the King be asked to pardon Slater.
As time went on, more came to light about Marion Gilchrist. During the Edwardian era, there were busy exchanges between dealers in precious stones. It transpired that Helen Lambie had an admirer, a bookmaker called Nugent, who took a great deal of interest in the flat. There were reports that he had gossiped widely about Gilchrist's jewellery collection.
The suspicion that Marion Gilchrist would not have admitted a stranger to her flat is quite so strong. But although I say she lived quite a solitary life, and as I say, she had few companions, her maid Helen Lambie did report that she did receive visitors. These were normally men, and when they came to the house, Helen Lambie was told to make herself scarce. And there certainly is some suggestion and perhaps even some evidence that Marion Gilchrist perhaps bought jewellery from these gentlemen, which added to her already extensive collection. And it may be that some of these items may have been reset or come from dubious sources.
Just a year into Slater's sentence, a book was published that dissected the case in minute detail. William Ruffhead's The Trial of Oscar Slater remains a celebrated textbook for law students to this day. It destroyed the case against him. In February 1925, Oscar Slater persuaded a fellow inmate to smuggle a note to Conan Doyle to ask him to pursue the matter officially.
It's suggested in various scripts that this note to Conan Doyle was smuggled out either under the gentleman's tongue or his dentures. But either way, clearly, he was willing to take that risk for Slater, and the note was passed to Conan Doyle.
Detective Inspector John Trench continued to insist quite publicly that Slater had been framed. He was the police officer who had searched the flat Slater shared with Madame Juno and Catherine Schmaltz and failed to find anything whatsoever that linked him to the crime. He was also the man who had interviewed the key witnesses in most detail. Right up until the outbreak of World War I, the government refused to lend any credence to John Trench's claims. Yet he stuck by his version of events. Trench said that on the night of the killing, Helen Lambie had referred to the man she saw on the stair as A.B.
He did so in the understanding that he would be protected, having revealed this information. However, Strathclyde police did not take the same view, and shortly after the secret inquiry, John Trench was dismissed from his position as a police officer without pension. This meant that he, his wife and their 6 children had lost their main and only source of income. The police also went on a vendetta, let's say, against Trench and the solicitor he'd consulted and framed them on a charge of reset, which was subsequently tried in Edinburgh High Court.
So if Oscar Slater didn't carry out the murder, who did and why? What was the motive behind this? Why were all these jewels left? Why was a document box broken into?
In 1927, finally admitted publicly that she had recognised the man on the stairs and that he was indeed the AB she had referred to in John Trench's presence. His full name remains a mystery.
Helen Lambie had a darker side which only came out much later.
The mystery of who did cause her death was never reopened by the police, and indeed to this day we still don't know who was responsible.
Did Gilchrist have an illegitimate child? Was the murderer a shunned relative? Or was she in hock to an unscrupulous jewellery dealer? Many years later, in 1961, a newspaper article made another assertion.
Remarkably, suspicion fell on one Francis Charters. This is a man who enjoyed a distinguished career as a professor of medicine at St Andrews University. His brother was also a member of the procurators and was an experienced and well-known lawyer. He was also a friend of Alexander Ure, the Lord Advocate, in the case of Slater, who prosecuted the case. There was some suggestion that the Charters family may have been involved in the murder of Marion. This was never found out.
The suggestion the Chartery brothers were involved doesn't seem to fit with their social class and background. Indeed, the suggestion that their motive was to obtain Marion Gilchrist's will is extremely unlikely, given that a copy of the will would have been lodged with their solicitor, and the Chartery brothers, being highly educated as doctors and lawyers, would have known that.
The campaign, led by Conan Doyle, finally reached Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald. In 1927, Slater was released from Peterhead on licence. The following summer, his conviction was quashed on the grounds of misdirection to the jury.
Your dress that you're wearing?
Well, I'm not sure whether my mother made that. She made quite a few dresses for me, and she may have made that one. I can't remember. That picture, that would be taken the year I saw Oscar Slater, and I must have been 8.
Kitty Ritchie, who was raised just by the scene of the crime in Glasgow, came face to face with Slater by the strangest coincidence as a child.
It would be 1928, and I had just, I think, had my 8th birthday, and I was on the beach at Aberdeen with one of my older cousins, and there was this atmosphere, that's all I can say, it's a strange atmosphere. Everything seemed to become quieter, and people were whispering to each other and looking, well, I suppose to my left. And I could hear, people who were near were saying, "Oh, that's Oscar Slater along there. That's Oscar Slater. He's just out of prison." He stood out against the crowd because everyone would be in summer wear, and he was in, oh gosh, it almost looked like winter wear. He had a long overcoat almost down to his ankles, and he had a bowler hat on. It was quite inappropriate for a beach in the summer. And he was walking along on what must have been quite firm sand. He was just pacing along slowly.
Oscar Slater was given £6,000 compensation, equating to around £300,000 today. He lived out his days in relative anonymity, but the legacy of his trial lives on. It was a case that shamed Scottish justice and led to the establishment of the Court of Appeal.
So, Jonathan, how does it feel to live in a place where such a gruesome thing happened?
I mean, I guess, I don't really believe, in the supernatural or anything, so I find it really interesting just in terms of, history and, it's kind of amazing to, you know, hear things about like Arthur Conan Doyle being interested in the case, and just even to be able to kind of like see a plan of your house from so long ago and see what it looked like. So yeah, I mean, I find it interesting. It's a really sad case, but not scary or anything. So.
The impact of the Oscar Slater case on the modern legal system in Scotland is perhaps the continuing knowledge and disquiet over the miscarriage of justice.
There has been no proper inquiry into this, no proper investigation, and we still don't know who carried out this murder. All we know for certain is it was not Oscar Slater.